And that's a virtuous cycle, we hope. But what drives that, of course, is the return on investment as well as risk. And so the focus here is really to help understand the concepts that contribute to this risk in the area of regulation, regulatory risks. And to step back, in my view, regulation really defines an industry, not just medical devices, but any industry. The costs and requirements of entry, the barriers to entry, this is the Warren Buffett moat, time to entry and a transition from startup to a commercial company, the competitive barriers, the capital requirements, how much time can you afford to run at whatever burn rate you have, and how does regulation affect that burn rate, the cost to remain in market once you get there. And then finally, and I would submit this is a very important element often overlooked, and that's the skills, the profile of the workforce and the culture of the workforce. Now think about medical devices within the broader context of regulated health technologies. And in fact, devices in many ways are among the more recent broad category of medical devices. And within this, we have a small subset called the in vitro diagnostic medical devices. Most devices are used on or in the human body in some form. And we've just heard a good example of that. But in vitro diagnostic medical devices are used to analyze samples withdrawn from the human body, typically fluids or cells of some kind. But there's also the big domain of drugs or medicines, and then of biologics, vaccines, and blood products. And if you think about it, the industry structure is different for the groups. Medical devices are characterized by a large number of small companies. 80% of the medical devices manufacturers registered with the FDA employ fewer than 50 people. The medicines industry is a small number of large, typically multinational companies. So that affects the dynamics of the industry, dynamics of innovation. But over time, we've also seen a convergence between these regulated sectors. And so that what has historically been regulated within independent silos, standalone silos, we're starting to see some overlaps at the margins. And we have now called combination products, where they have the attributes of a medical device, they also have the attributes of a drug. So one of the questions is, how is a combination product regulated? Is it the combination of all the regulations that apply in both sectors, or some subset, and so on? Now, as a patient, or a family member of a patient, as a citizen, as a taxpayer, what are the policy objectives of the regulation of health products? Well, the first and most obvious, of course, is to protect and promote public health. And we do that in part through assuring the safety, quality, performance, identity of these products. We also need to know who's responsible for placing these products on the market. If there's a problem, who do we reach out and touch for corrective action or to take enforcement action against? And finally, and most regulators would probably not think of this top of mind, but is to facilitate trade, because increasingly the trade in medical devices, like so many other sectors, is international. Products are produced in other markets. So let's focus now on medical devices and a little bit of history to put this in context. And the history of regulation actually begins over 100 years ago in 1906. And this was at a time when quack medicines were not unfamiliar. A lot of foods were being placed on the marketplace that were unsafe, food additives. So that led to the creation of the 1906 Pure Food and Drugs Act, which then established the precursor to the Food and Drug Administration, the regulator we know today. The next major step was 1938 with the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and then the medical device amendments, which for the first time identified medical devices as a separate category of regulated products and gave the US FDA power to regulate medical devices. So it's relatively recent, whereas these others were much older and better established. Medical devices were a later development, and that's in large part, driven by the rapid development, almost an explosion, if you will, of medical technologies around that time. It was an outgrowth of the Cooper Commission during the Nixon administration. And since that time, the FD&C Act has been amended many times related to medical devices. So, this is what FDA looks like today. It's a large, sprawling organization. FDA likes to say it's the largest consumer protection authority in the country. It employs over 18,000 people, and you can see that they have responsibility for biologics, drugs, foods, tobacco products, veterinary medicine. Not shown here is cosmetics, but anyway, a very broad portfolio of regulatory interests. The one we're most, lost that one. The one we're most interested in here is the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, which employs about 10% of the employees of FDA. Now I'm going to start, and this is where we start getting into the nerdy stuff, with definitions. And definitions are really important in this area because it defines what is regulated, in other words, what kinds of products, who is regulated, how are they regulated, and the boundaries between regulated sectors. So, as you think about medical devices, give me some examples. What's the term bring up in your mind? Just CPAP, right. Pacemaker. Heart valve. Insulin pump. Ventilator. Okay, so why do you think those are medical devices? What leads you to think they're a medical device?
They have hardware.
They have hardware.
Patient contact.
Patient contact.
Physical objects.
Physical objects. Used in clinical practice, maybe.
Improve health.
Yeah. Improve health. Okay, well let's look at how FDA defines it. Well first, and Kathy, to your point, it's an instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, implant, blah, 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 or component parts or accessories. So with the exception of software, a medical device is something tangible, something you can drop on your foot. It's not a molecule. It's intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or other animals. So diagnosis or therapy, essentially. Or it's intended to affect the structure or any function of the body, and you always have to read to the end of a definition, and which does not achieve its primary intended purposes through chemical action within or on the body of man, and which is not dependent upon being metabolized to achieve its primary intended purpose. Now you'll note also that I've highlighted here the phrase intended purpose, and we'll come back to this concept several times. Jim, did you have a question?
I was just thinking, you know, we've looked at these glucose monitors for diabetic patients.
Right.
That first sentence would tell me that that's not a medical device.
No. Well, back up. So your glucose monitor, right?
Actually, I was thinking about the pump that some folks.
Oh, an insulin infusion pump?
Yeah.
Okay, but some of those devices have glucose sensors in them.
Yes.
And so it has the ability to measure in real time the fluctuating value of blood glucose.
Right.
Okay. So you're suggesting, A, it's intended for use, well, first it's a thing.
No, it was the first sentence on the
Right.
next slide, but.
Okay, and which does not achieve its primary intended purpose through chemical action.
Yeah.
Well, if it's just an infusion pump, then it's not achieving through chemical action. So I think you're talking about the one that senses and infuses, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, so the primary intended action is the infusion, not the sensing. And that would be the logic in
All right,
that.
okay,
Okay, so it's the modifier there of primary. Okay, so this is the FDA definition. It's a multi-part definition. And remember this theme of intended purpose. So how does FDA define intended purpose or intended use? Refer to the objective intent of the persons who are legally responsible for the labeling of the device. And labeling is defined broadly as not only the labels, but instructions for use, promotional material, advertisements, statements made on the internet, or whatever. So FDA will look at those as fact questions. That intent is determined by such persons' expressions or may be shown by the circumstances under which a product is made available for use. And that may take into account labeling claims, advertising material, oral or written statements. And companies get into trouble by what their statement says, or their salesperson says on the floor of an exhibition at a medical convention. FDA often sends their investigators incognito to sales shows and will talk to sales reps and say, so how can I use this? What do you use it for? What kind of patients would it be used for? And this is how you can get into trouble. And it may be shown by the circumstances that the article is with the knowledge of such persons offered and used for the purpose for which it is neither labeled nor represented. Now, this brings us to a case that we had, and remember, and Craig referred to it with Joylux. And I didn't talk earlier, but there's another category of products in the marketplace that FDA defines as general wellness devices, which sort of are on the border of medical devices. And so FDA defines those as an intended use that relates to maintaining or encouraging a general state of health or healthy activity. In other words, not diagnosis or therapy. And that relates to the role of healthy lifestyle to reduce the impact of certain chronic diseases or conditions. And where it's well understood that healthy lifestyle choices may play an important role in health outcomes. So this is a different definition than for medical devices. And here are the domains where general wellness devices would apply. So when we were looking at Joylux and contrasting that with Medora, two products that at the surface have similar intended uses and intended users, then you get into what's the purpose. And Joylux was saying that this is a general wellness device because it fits into one of these functions here. Whereas Medora is making a therapeutic claim. So it goes to the question of the intended purpose. But also it looks at to me, as part of our due diligence, is to look at that conduct of the company in the marketplace. How do they, through their actions, through their website, through their advertisements, through their promotional activities, position it and how it would be used? And is there a risk that a sales rep will stray over the line and be seen to promote a general wellness device for what is really a medical device use?
Michael, what happens to the company that does stray over that line? What's the
Well,
remedy for that?
FDA would typically do some kind of follow-up investigation. They would contact the company, ask for copies of all their promotional material, all their sales training information, transcripts, how they work with key opinion leader physicians and so on. And if FDA felt it was serious enough, they would typically issue a warning letter, which is essentially the first step towards a more serious enforcement action. And they could eventually take further sanctions, ban the product from the marketplace, require the company to stop promoting it in a certain way, retrain its sales force, pay a penalty.
Are you allowed to enter the market as a general product and move to the next if you have more information later?
Yes, yes, you can. So Joylux could, for example, place their product on the market as a general wellness product, but then anecdotally they gather information that says this helps a certain condition. The risk there is that they would then start promoting it for that against the law, essentially. What they should do is then conduct clinical evaluation of it and then go through the FDA regulatory process to have it approved for marketing as a medical device. Joe?
I saw sleep management.
Sleep management, right.
Under general wellness.
Right.
And when I think of that, I think of CPAP, which requires a prescription.
Right.
Which would seem to be a control.
Well, and prescription is not necessarily an indication of a medical device or not, but sleep management, if they make a statement that it's simply to help you sleep better, that's a general wellness claim. If it's to treat sleep apnea, then that makes it a medical device. So this is why, and Kathy has seen me sort of go down the rabbit hole during due diligence reviews on labeling and promotion. It's because of the risk of stepping over this boundary. Now, as you think about regulation of health products, and any product, whether it's aircraft or electrical appliances in your home, medical devices, you have a varying scale of risk from low to high risk. And as taxpayers and as citizens, you'd say the regulatory control should be proportional to the level of risk, right? And so as we look at the domain of medical devices, it probably falls as some kind of a spectrum like this, where you've got some very low risk products down here to high risk ones up here. It's not efficient for FDA to apply the same level of controls to the low risk products as the high risk ones. And as you think about evaluating the risks, what does a regulator take into account? And I've just outlined some of them here. None of these will be very surprising to you. How does it act on the body? What's the duration of the contact? Is it a shorter, long-term exposure? Is it chronic? Will it be for the rest of the patient's life, or is it just for this episode of care? Is it invasive? Meaning, does it go through a natural body orifice, or is it non-invasive in that it goes through some other surgically created, reverse that. Non-invasive is through a naturally formed body orifice. Invasive requires generally surgery through some created opening. Is it implanted? Meaning, is it intended to remain in the body for more than 30 days? That's the arbitrary cutoff between implants and non-implants. Does it deliver energy such as electricity or ultrasound, or does it deliver substances such as gas, blood, medicines, solutions? What's the potential significance of diagnostic information? Is it identifying blood types, in which case it has to be very accurate to prevent infusing the wrong blood type and killing the patient? Or can it be a lower risk of identifying a pregnancy? Is it to detect the presence of HIV virus in blood used in blood infusions, transfusions? Is it intended for a professional or a lay user? And what's the degree of novelty? Is it an established technology, or is it something never been seen before in this application? So in the 1976 Act, FDA established 3 classes of medical devices, from low to moderate risk to high risk, class 1 to 3. And if you want to know which class your product is in, you then go to the FDA database, and they've identified 1,700 generic categories of medical devices. And I know you can't read these very well. This is just a list. 1,700 categories of devices split into 16 medical specialties panels. And so you can find your stethoscope head, or your plethysmograph, or your colposcope. And then when you click on that, then it will tell you for a manual toothbrush, there it is. Here it's defined, and it's a class 1. Oops. And then for a heart valve, mechanical, then it's a class 3, which intuitively sort of makes sense, right?
So would a product like, this may be unfair, but the Navisonics we just saw, would that fit into Cat 3?
I don't know, Jens, do you want to say, the question was, what class would the Navisonics device be in? Class 2.
Class 2.
And remember, it's delivering energy. It's used for, in this case, not a diagnostic purpose. It's an aid to a therapeutic application, right? So then the proportionality principle comes in. So all but a very few medical devices are subject to what are called general controls. I'll explain that in a minute. Class 2 devices subject to general controls and then special controls. And then the class 3 high-risk devices are ones that are subject to PMA or pre-market approval.
Where's Medora on that little picture?
Where's
Medora?
Well, Medora would be a class 2 device, as I recall. I'd have to check, but they would be there. So.
Would Joylux be class 1? Would Joylux be even a class 1?
No, because it's not a medical device. It's a general wellness device, which doesn't have classification
Except they say
in
a
it.
lot of things in their advertising that might make it jump over the line in here.
Right, right. So general controls, these apply across the board to all classes of medical devices. And I won't go into detail, but prohibitions against adulteration and misbranding. You can see that actually goes back to the 1906 regulation of food safety. You don't think of adulteration of a piece of technology, but that's where the term comes from. Registration of manufacturers, importers, and distributors. That's essentially saying I'm a manufacturer and I'm placing myself under the jurisdiction of FDA. FDA uses that to not only know who's on the market, but to decide where they will do their inspections. Or if there's a problem with a product in the marketplace, who do they touch? How do they reach those people? A listing of the devices that are marketed, so every year the manufacturer has to submit a list. Labeling, there are specific requirements on what's in a label and what cannot appear in a label. Records and reports you have to maintain and make available for inspection. Adverse event reporting, post-marketing surveillance, pre-market notification. Before you can place a medical device on the market, you have to tell FDA you're doing so. And then good manufacturing practice requirements. And remember, Craig gave us the example in Aqueduct earlier about them falling afoul. We don't know the details, but somewhere in regard to quality systems compliance, good manufacturing. All manufacturers are subject to inspection by FDA. They can come to any location where devices are manufactured, where their specifications are developed, where they're stored, where they're processed. FDA does about 2,500 to 3,000 inspections of medical devices per year. So for class 2 devices, you have all those general controls, and then you have the possibility of some additional controls, such as, for example, mandatory performance standards. So like an automated blood pressure cuff has to achieve certain accuracy, or an in vitro diagnostic test have no more than a certain number of false positives and false negatives, and so on. Additional requirements for post-market surveillance, so not just waiting for an adverse event to occur and reporting it, but in fact tracking the performance of the device in use. Patient registries, knowing where long-term implantable devices are implanted and what the experience is with those devices. Maybe some special labeling requirements, pre-market data requirements, and then guidance. FDA has some specific guidance on specific categories of devices. It's very difficult to generalize in class 2 as to what's required because it's such a diverse range of products. And remember, 1,700 generic categories, you can't have one set of regulation and requirements that applies to all devices. And then for class 3, these are devices that are defined as ones that were not in the market before May of 1976. Remember why that date's important? I'm sorry?
That's when the law was.
That's when the law was passed, amended to regulate medical devices. or devices that are life-supporting or life-sustaining, or to prevent impairment of human health, and so on and so forth. And all Class 3 devices, with a few exceptions, require pre-market approval application, which is the most rigorous, most demanding level of scientific review of medical devices. So now, getting to market. And we've heard several times, and Jens, you talked about the 510K required for your device. As I said, Class 2, and in fact most of Class 1 devices require a 510K notification. The 510K is only a reference to the clause in the Act. It's sort of like a 401K term, and it means pre-market notification. You're telling FDA you're placing a certain medical device on the market. You're making yourself and that product under the jurisdiction of FDA, and FDA then has to form an opinion on that notification as to whether to clear it and allow the device to be placed on the market or not. I'll come back to more detail in a minute. Pre-market approval for Class 3 devices is the most rigorous one, and then what's called de novo classification. So these are the three routes to market, and they may require an IDE, an investigational device exemption. So let's look at those four pathways in more detail.
Medora had ID as one of their.
Right, and we'll look at why they have to do that.
Are those all mutually exclusive, or could somebody have to go through all three? Or?
No, they're mutually exclusive, but if you fail at one, you may have to go back and go through another one.
Okay.
Now, I put here 90 days, 180 days, and 150 days. That's what the law says for the period of time FDA has to review a submission. FDA has rarely fulfilled those targets. But I just put them up there because A, it's what the law says, and B, when we think about timelines and credibility of regulatory strategies, that's an important consideration for investors. So, pre-market notification. And remember that for devices that require some prior review by FDA, over 90% go to market via 510K. A small number go through de novo, a small number go through PMA. So 510K is the predominant route to market in the United States. And it requires a demonstration of substantial equivalence, that's the term, to another device that's lawfully marketed in the United States. And you might say, well, why is that? Well, if you look at the legislative history of the 1976 device amendments, it was intended as a grandfather clause because it was felt that if you have the bad luck to have a device that is now subject to regulation competing against someone else who had a very similar device already in the market before May of '76, you'd be at a competitive disadvantage. So you were allowed, under the early law, to claim substantial equivalence and grandfather your device into the market and allow it to be placed. Now, over the years since 1976, FDA adopted a very expansive policy on the implementation and enforcement of 510K. So it was not just equivalence to a device in the market before May '76, but in fact a device that had subsequently been allowed to be marketed. So the essential showing is that it's substantially equivalent to a device lawfully in the market. So what does substantial equivalence mean? Well, that the new device is at least as safe and effective as what's called the predicate, the pre-existing device lawfully in the market. Craig?
Well, CurvaFix did that with the straight screw. They were substantially equivalent to a straight screw.
Exactly right. So, and in more detail then, it's substantially equivalent if in comparison to the predicate, so the CurvaFix versus the straight screw, it has the same intended use. So here's our old friend, the phrase intended use. Has the same intended use as the predicate and has the same technological characteristics. So in this case, the titanium metal used in the CurvaFix was the same as used in prior screws. The mechanism by which it's inserted is the same, and so on. So they were able to make the claim and satisfy FDA that it's substantially equivalent, or that it has the same intended use as the predicate and different technological characteristics, but that those technological characteristics do not raise different questions of safety and effectiveness. And then that information submitted to FDA demonstrate the device is at least as safe and effective as the legally marketed device. Contrast that to the PMA route, where the essential showing is that the device itself, in isolation, is safe and effective. Now remember, when I showed this slide earlier, the first thing I said about class 3 devices in their definition is that they're ones that are not within a type that was marketed before May 1976. And the original drafters of the law then presumed that any new device that didn't or wasn't able to use the grandfather would then automatically be class 3. But that then raises the question of proportionality of regulatory controls. It might mean that you come up with a new tongue depressor that wasn't a type in the market before May of '76, but it clearly doesn't need all the regulatory controls of a class 3 device. So FDA more recently, and this is in the 1990s, developed what's called the de novo pathway. So it provides a pathway that allows the regulator to classify novel medical devices for which general controls alone or general and special controls provide a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness for the intended use, but where you cannot point to a legally marketed predicate device. So you can't use the grandfather. So it's inserting a risk-based classification back in rather than just saying anything new is automatically class 3. And then you've heard the definition of IDE, or the term IDE, I should say. The E means exemption. And before, under the FD&C Act, before you can place a product on the market and make it available for use, you have to demonstrate it's safe and effective. But if you don't have evidence to support it, you can't make that claim. And so it becomes a bit of a catch-22. So the exemption is to allow you to place a device into use, gather scientific evidence on the clinical safety and performance. It has to be labeled appropriately, and so on. In order to use an IDE, the manufacturer has to, in most cases, obtain ethics committee approval from the local institutions where the trial would be done, and then they have to get FDA approval, and it's a shorter review cycle, it's 30 days. And most clinical trials involving medical devices, and certainly those of high risk class 3, would be done using an IDE. Now Glenn, to your point, if you use the example of, say, Joylux then wanting to convert to a regulated medical device, they might very well have to then submit an IDE, even though the product is already lawfully on the market, but to gather the clinical evidence to show that they fulfill the 510K or PMA requirements. Yes?
Just a couple more minutes and
Yep,
then we'll deal with
I'm nearly done.
Awesome.
Okay, and then just a final point. Those of you who followed developments in the medicines area will know that typically drugs, pharmaceutical trials follow a 3-stage trial. They begin with healthy volunteers and then the target population and then a broader population, and they're looking for different data at different stages. Medical devices typically do not follow the same trial design. And there are a number of other differences. For example, most medicine trials are done using randomized double-blind controlled trials. It's harder to do a double-blind trial with medical devices, how do you test a knee prosthesis without someone knowing that you've done an intervention? Do you actually do a surgery, open them up, and then don't put an implant in? And then that raises technical problems, also ethical problems. So clinical trial is different between medical devices and drugs. So now, this is trying to pull it together, which is, you are here. You want to be here, which is in the market. So, just briefly, the question, is a product medical device? In other words, is it subject to device regulation? If yes, what device class is it? And then depending on the class, then the different routes you would go through. I've also shown, is it a general wellness device? So for a high-risk class device, then you would go typically through an IDE, conduct your clinical trial, the clinical data goes into the PMA application, you hope it's approved, and then to market. A class 2, but for a device that's a de novo device and is a lower risk device, then you would go into, is there a predicate device? If no, can you make an argument successfully that it's a lower moderate risk device? And then no, then you'd go into an IDE, have to do a PMA, and so on. If yes, then you can submit a de novo application, and you hope that would lead you to market. Class 2, some devices are exempt. If not, do you need to do a clinical trial? No. 510K, and remember, this is the path most devices go to market. So finally, then as we do due diligence on potential investments, here are the kinds of questions that run through my mind, and I hope now you'll have a flavor of why I think of these questions. So first, is it a medical device? So we look at the labeling, the claims, and what does it say about the intended purpose? What class? Because of course a higher risk class device will require more evidence, a longer process, and that may be beyond our reach as investors. Is FDA pre-marketing review required? There are some low risk devices that are exempt, so you don't even have to go through that stage. Which review pathway? Is there adequate, credible clinical evidence to support that regulatory pathway? And I say credible because I was involved in a case where we were doing an acquisition due diligence review. For business reasons, we chose not to pursue it. Another company bought that company, and it turned out the clinical data on which it was based was fraudulent. FDA went in and investigated it and, in fact, pursued criminal prosecution. But to me, that was a dodged bullet. How do you detect fraud in clinical data? Does the company have and implemented a suitable quality management system? This is GMP. This is the Aqueduct example. Is there a strategy for that marketing authorization? How would they get through that flow chart I outlined? And then this goes back to one of my early points about the workforce. Is there a culture of compliance? Remember, your marketing authorization is really just the ticket to play, but your ability to stay in the market is compliance. And the fastest way to destroy shareholder value is non-compliance and be shut down, or to have your production line suspended. I talked only about FDA-enforced regulations, but there are other regulations that apply to medical devices, such as a device that uses telemetry. They're subject to FCC regulation in the US for wireless spectrum use. So there may be a whole other domain of regulation that we've not talked about. And then finally, that marketing authorization is not the same thing as reimbursement. And so you may have FDA authorization to market, but no one will pay you for it. And that's a very different set of questions. So I've covered a lot of ground, high level. You've all stayed awake. Kathy.
So I listened to an interview by, she's an oncologist slash researcher in the liquid cancer area. And she made the comment that of all drugs that enter into the FDA process, only 5% actually make it
earlier days, we had a lot more visibility into the number of applications and the outcomes. Unfortunately, FDA has stopped publishing that. There used to be an annual report that would come out and tell us that. And I haven't been able to find a recent one, I mean, within the last 7 years of that. But I would say the yield is much higher than it is in the pharmaceutical area. And typically medicines will fall out during the clinical trial stage, not at the final IND or new drug application stage. So I would say, just as the industry structure is reversed between medical devices and medicines, so it is with the regulatory approvals as well. Rob?
So the Apple Watch would be a wellness device, says to get up and move and count your steps, but when it starts doing an EKG, does it slip over now?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. That's right. And that's where a lot of these mobile telephone apps that are health related,
Yeah.
I mean, Apple is not making medical devices. Your mobile phone is not a medical device. And the fact that someone puts an app on it that has a medical application does not make the phone a medical device. But the producer of the app on the phone may become a medical device manufacturer based on their intended claims, on their claims of the intended purpose. So what Apple is doing now with their Apple Watch and gathering data could at some point put them over that line. Mark?
Are there sufficient penalties against a company that says, I'm just going to call myself Class 1 for now and see if anybody notices? I mean, whose onus is it to prove that they're in a different class, and what are the penalties severe enough to say you should have been a Class 2 or Class 3, but you didn't?
Well, if you submit a 510K, one of the early questions FDA looks at is, did you properly classify it? And if you didn't, they would simply
look at it
reject
right then.
They'll detect it and then reject it.
So they were
right
early
then.
on. Okay, all right.
If, however, you have you claim you have a Class 1 exempt device that doesn't require a 510K, then you could get away with it in the market for some undefined time. Typically, you get in trouble because FDA, as part of its market surveillance activities, finds it, or more often, a competitor shops you.
That's it.
And then, do they have sufficient penalties? Yeah, up to criminal prosecution and imprisonment.
Okay.
Quit doing it, Mark.
I ruined my plans for the day.
Okay, thank you, I'm done. Take any other
Thank you.
questions?
So, Michael, we're going to need a remedial class in like a month. So. Thanks, folks. Just for a quick reminder, fill these things out. Secondly, you should be getting the email this afternoon with the electronic survey for tomorrow's meeting, and please try and make the meeting. So thank you. Thanks, Representative. One is just I think it's an email. I think that someone presentation is fine. It would be nice to have an answer to all that'd be great.
Okay, Anyway, thank you, John. Well, a lot of
That was so good. I was like, I remember it. Might have to do a rerun. We're trying to figure this out. The flow chart is
There's boats in Florida already too. You would check the bills for the deck of a freighter. Get shipped back to we do that sometimes just because there's two of those that like every company that does an hour and a half though. Three to start. Yeah, sure. Tidal currents moving toward green yellow.
Figure out the date when you're
It only gets worse. 100% surface green, and then all the best is green, and then it degrades to yellow in between. You can't do that. Otherwise, you'll never invest in prices are different. Must have been yellow in the middle or somewhere. And it happens all the time. But we didn't know that there was fraud. It wasn't fraud, but it was kind of misfortune. You know what? Look at the devices. They 95%
People gave me money. And now,
That's what I would recommend.
so when that has to be up in market.
And I think you do have one here, like,
We were one after,
We
one
went
after.
from bright, started choosing them bright green to bright red and.
Yeah, it needs to yellow in 1 hour.
I think you also have to be careful what you say.
Here it is. I've never designed a size.
Well, just the one that I've just showed you, is so small. You bought it
Yes.
We got
That was subsequent deals forced you into that, or the structure.
all of those things happen. Oh, I don't think I think I would turn, because we're doing you go to house, I'm on a house over there, so there's a house, I mean, there's nothing. She's going to school for years.
Listen to this
We'll keep the med students will rent it for you. So it's a good opportunity.
I understand that.
But I'm not my definition. I've seen it before once in darkness for battlefield. I was looking at the facts, is it strength, yeah, as opposed to treating weakness.
If you recommend an arm, you have to put your money on the line.
So these are very factual.
We have to do our.
In fact, it's interesting also that this device in Europe, so the same catheter that I use, and we have a bunch of this is where it is definition. So I'm not here. We have documented. Or a stent, small little stent used.
Grab your name tags, fellas.
We'll make sure we
Thank you.
Let me do it.
Are you going?
So you're gonna be there tomorrow?
Yeah, and I was just telling Craig, we need to talk about the meeting in January to make sure we know what we can fit in. I mean, if everybody's willing to stay up too, it doesn't matter. Good turnout before Christmas. January morning, something on here. Nobody's leaving. Well, just 2 years in a row. We know people will come, but I mean, maybe it would have been more if it wasn't frequent. There's still been enough. And January, and we'll go run over. I mean, we got to raise and reset expectations on things. Well, who knows?
We ran over last year with Vassal, so we're canceling.
I think about 2 hours and an hour and a half. Other ones.
All right, we'll talk about it.
Yeah, we'll do it tomorrow. I believe Greg will be
One of us.
Yeah, I don't know. Keep taking it. So what's the
Thank you, Jim. That was great. Appreciate it. Obviously, you can figure out who the neurosurgeon was. Yeah, we're trying to keep it a secret, but it kind of leaked out. Leak out is the wrong word to use in this case. It's a bad
I like
word.
to make sure that everybody's got sort of a big brother sort of thing.
You can make a pit stop and all.
Okay, great. Yeah, he's my big brother. Okay, great.
You need help or anything else?
What more you do besides, I mean, like what more I could have done besides saying, here's what we